Sunday, December 14th, 2008. Here's a poem I wrote called Decisions. It's not about anyone, really. When I tell you will make all the difference. At sunrise, a beginning worth waking up for, hope, lights filling into dark. At midday, a constant. You'd know it's bright, reliable, worthy of trust. Sunset would be sappy, bittersweet because the beauty is the end. I should phrase it in French, parce que c'est romantique, je t'aime. I should say it in Spanish, porque no me entenderías, te amo. I should show you in sign because actions speak louder than words. I won't tell you in English because you would not need translation. You would know me, and that would be too much. I like the idea I get across. I want to tell this person I love him with all the symbolism of what time and everything, but I'm afraid of the honesty that would come with him actually understanding what I meant. With Colin right now, I'm not ready to admit I'm interested in him. I just love talking to him every night, letting our friendship grow and such. I married him. I've written a lot of young adult fiction in my life. From the cliche, poorly world-built dystopia I wrote because everyone was a decade ago, to a bunch of contemporary fiction, to a novel in verse, much of my work has been in this realm. But I was writing young adult fiction long before 2012 when I thought of my post-apocalyptic story. Between September of 2002 and December of 2009, from my freshman year of high school through graduating college, I filled 20 journals. Not wrote in for a day or two. Filled. Which mostly means I know far more about myself as a teenager and young 20-something than I'd want to. But one of the things that I know about myself from reading back on these journals is how unreliable I was at capturing events objectively. For instance, outside of that poem, though I still think about this guy, I don't obsess over him or worry about what will happen with us too much. I wrote in January in 2005. Less than a page later, written the same day, I was hoping that he would join our group of friends for a trip to a play at a different high school is putting on. Entry after entry, I would note how a song or a poem is not about anyone in particular, like I did with Decisions, and then follow it with a story that for some strange reason perfectly matches the circumstances of my writing. Weird. But what does this have to do with writing fiction? Unreliable narrators can be more relatable. When I first started writing novels, I wasn't very good at it, and so I was really intentional about looking up every single source that I possibly could to learn how to write a novel well. One of those was the website Helping Writers Become Authors by K.M. Weiland, and she talks about writing scenes in two parts: the action and the reaction, or the scene and the sequel. That sequel is something that a lot of writers forget about, and I thought was just the key to writing something amazing. And in a lot of ways, I wasn't wrong. The sequel is all about reacting to the disaster or complication from the previous scene, weighing the options, and then making a choice about what to do next. I feel like a lot of books will skip this, and there's a lot of character development that happens in a sequel. I learned about this in 2015 when I was working on my first YA contemporary story about a character who made morally great choices. I wasn't interested in making her heroic or entirely good, but I did want her choices to be understood. I wrote sequels that dug deep into her potential choices, all A and B and C and D, and the reasons that she chose A. In my head, I was writing a complex character and exploring why some people make decisions that seem immoral to others. That didn't translate. Critique partner after critique partner called my main character insufferable. Maybe not in those words, but essentially. Because of how she would ruminate on things, because of how I implemented those sequels with the reaction, the dilemma, and the decision. So in the summer of 2017, I set out to fix it. I laid out the book, my critique partner comments, and I taught myself how to developmentally edit a story. I thought a lot about Blanca, the main character. I modeled her after my journals, where I watched myself skip over details to paint myself in a good light to myself. To that end, 99% of my editing on this book was taking things out. I didn't let her think of every possible response she could have. B and C and D didn't even cross her mind. Only the one she wanted and a justification for why it was the right decision. A little while later, I got re-edit comments from the critique partner who challenged me to work on her character. This is what she said. I think you made Blanca more likable for me. She can still be selfish and make mistakes, but don't we all? I can see a bit more of how Emma considers her a friend and how Daniel falls for her. Her response to seeing less of Blanca's inner thoughts was to like her more, to see the good in her and to root for her. And all I had to do was get out of her head. Nothing changed in the plot. Why does it work? You can build tension in your narrator's unreliability, like the poem I read at the beginning of this video that I say isn't about anyone in particular, before immediately saying that I have developing feelings for somebody. There's tension in this lack of awareness. Like the 2005 entry, when I can say in one breath I'm over someone while still hoping to see him again and write about him. But despite being quite brilliant at this in my journals and developing my own unreliability as a narrator and a reader's own lack of trust in my spin on events, it took me until my fourth book, where I intentionally planned to write a fall arc and a villain origin story before I actually wrote an unreliable narrator intentionally. This book is an origin story for the Enchantress of Beauty and the Beast, where I wanted to establish the Enchantress as a villain and talk about how she gets to the point where she decides to enchant the Beast. She's not a good person by the end of the book, not by a long shot. But all of my CPs who read drafts of my Enchantress book called Celeste compelling and interesting. Her role as an unreliable narrator telling the story of her own fall from grace somehow made her more likable than Blanca in my previous book, who was truly trying her best. Tension shows up in books in several ways, but there's one I think is easy to overlook, especially as a new writer. Tension between what the narrator describes and how the narrator interprets those events pays really high dividends. Think about romance novels. They are built on the backs of the 3Ds: denial, denial, and denial. I don't love him and I never will. He couldn't possibly love me. We'll never be able to make this work. No one wants to read a romance between two people who know they're interested, are mature enough to say so, and then pursue the relationship. Conversely, no one wants to read a romance novel between two people who are actually disinterested in each other. The magic is in the middle. A romance between people who think they're not interested, but they actually are and would be made better by this relationship. Think You've Got Mail or Notting Hill or 10 Things I Hate About You or any of those classic 90s and early 2000s romance movies. They're about people who are actually interested in each other but would rather die than say so out loud. This tension keeps us hooked all the way from the meet cute to the happily ever after. But it's not just in romances this is true. Most character growth comes from the tension between a lie a main character believes and, initially, their denial that this lie is no longer serving them. We see how a lie of I can't rely on anyone but myself is hurting the main character, but they haven't learned to let go and trust people. Yet. We see the person that they need to start trusting and their hesitation to do so. This tension keeps us hooked. One of the final ways that you can use unreliable narration to hook an audience is most obvious in suspense and thrillers. I read an adult suspense book by Laurie Elizabeth Flynn called Till Death Do Us Part. The narrators aren't reliable, of course, they can't be in a suspense novel, and a twist near the end makes me want to go back and reread, focusing on clues that would point me to that reveal. The now classic We Were Liars does the same thing. And though I actually haven't read it yet, I'm kind of scared of it in some ways. One of us is lying follows this mold as well, as far as I understand. Most suspense or thrillers in book form and movie form do. The best part of using unreliable narration in suspense and thrillers is to invite the reader to return to the story with our eyes fully open. I had no interest in watching Sixth Sense when it came out because suspenseful movies often scare me. But when I learned about the reveal, I watched it for the first time, but with a rewatcher's eyes. I looked for the clues that were there the whole time, and they were plentiful. It delighted me, and now I love having good stories spoiled, so I can experience this feeling of rewatching or rereading without committing to watching or reading something twice. However, just because suspense and thrillers provide examples where unreliable narration is all but necessary, it's not limited to a specific genre. Whether you're writing contemporary, romance, suspense, or even fantasy or sci-fi, the techniques we've explored can elevate your storytelling. By embracing unreliable narration, you can create more relatable characters by showing their contradictions and giving them less room to ruminate on potential outcomes. Let their imperfections make them human. You can also build tension and the gap between what a narrator thinks they believe and what they do. By saying one thing and doing another, you invite a reader to explore what the truth is and hope that the character will learn consciously what they seem to know subconsciously already. And finally, you can craft stories that reward returning to a story by giving rereaders clues to ways in which the narrator is unreliable long before we learn the truth. So the next time you work on your story, consider how your main character's bias controls how they describe events and how they make decisions. What are their blind spots to their own reasoning? How might they intentionally hide something from the reader? Embracing this unreliability can create compelling and seemingly contradictory, honest writing that resonates with the reader's own complex experiences.